Hi, I'm Tom Birkeland, author of An Introduction to the Policy Process and professor of public policy at North Carolina State University. I hope you enjoy the book, and I hope you find these videos useful.
Welcome back, and this video is about the study of public policy. A lot of you are studying public policy for a lot of different reasons. Some of you may be studying it because it's a requirement in a program you're in a college course. Others may be studying it just out of personal interest, or perhaps you're exploring public policy as a career option, and maybe you're in a graduate public policy program or in a public administration program or some other program where public policy is important. There's all kinds of reasons why you would study public policy. A lot of people that may not think of themselves as social scientists become involved in public policy because of their expertise. It's a fabulous field. I really enjoy studying it. And in this video, I'm going to provide a little background on how the policy process field works with relation to other ways we think of policy making, public policy, and also how the policy process relates to other disciplines in the social sciences, which is really interesting because the message I'd like you to take home is that no matter what your social scientific background, if you are a social scientist, you have a home in public policy. There's a role for you in public policy, and all the social sciences have a role to play in understanding what government does, why it does it, how it does it, and all the various manifestations of public policy. So let's get into the study of public policy by first considering the question of why people study public policy. Why do we do this? And I think you can reduce it to two broad categories. The first is theoretical or scientific reasons. We study public policy because it gives us a better insight on certain features of the political process. That's the reason I became interested in the study of public policy, because I think that in studying public policy, we can better understand politics and better understand why it is our government does some things and chooses not to do others. So those are the reasons I study it. But there's also a a practical or applied reason for studying public policy as well. As I mentioned in the intro, some of you may be looking to study public policy as a career. You may be in a role in a job in which policy is important. I'll give you an example. When I taught at the State University of New York at Albany about 15 years ago, I was involved in something called the Biodiversity and Conservation Policy Program, in which people learned about both conservation biology and public policy so they could get jobs working in groups like the Nature Conservancy and various other environmental groups. And having that combination of science and policy is a really powerful combination. In fact, a lot of people with technical or scientific skills, engineers, architects, biologists, chemists, doctors, study public policy because they want their work to have a policy referent or influence. They want to influence what government does. So there's a lot of practical or applied reasons why you'd want to get involved in studying public policy. And you can make a lot of difference in the policy process, even by taking a course or two or reading a few books. So you don't have to get a full degree. Just learning a little bit about it can be immensely helpful for many people. And I hope you find this book and your studies helpful in that regard. With that in mind, then, how have you been involved in public policy? Have you been an elected official, or are you thinking about becoming an elected official? I think learning about the public policy process would make you a more effective elected official in a lot of ways. Have you ever voted for a candidate based on issue preferences, or have you ever voted on things like a bond for raising money for schools or for transportation or parks? Or have you ever voted on a change to your city charter to allow for certain kinds of economic development to take place, for example? Any electoral behavior may be related to your public policy preferences. So you may be involved in public policy to the extent that you choose the issues that matter to you and you use that as a way to decide who to vote for. Have you ever joined a group to promote or oppose an action? Have you ever joined a group like an environmental group, or perhaps if you own guns and enjoy shooting sports, you might have joined the National Rifle Association, or maybe you think that there needs to be more gun regulation, and so you joined a gun regulation group. That's one of the most high-profile controversies in American politics now. But a lot of people join interest groups. You might join the PTA at your school, the parent-teacher organization at a child's school, to raise money for the school, but also perhaps to lobby for more education funding. These are all reasons why you might get involved in public policy. I think a lot of people get involved in public policy episodically. So the question is, when might you do any of those things? You might do them because you're just really intensely interested and you do it all your life, or you might come and go in the policy process because you were motivated to do it by something that happened in the world, in your community, that motivated you to become involved. These are all good reasons to get involved in public policy. There's no bad reason to get involved in public policy. There's an awful lot of good reasons that we need lots of people to be involved in it. But I want you to understand where policy processes fits within these different ways of studying public policy. Because if you go to a professor says, oh, I study public policy, I'm a professor of public policy, it's very likely that you're going to encounter somebody who studies public policy very differently than some other professor of public policy. You could take two public policy conferences and find that people at each of these conferences don't overlap very much because of the way they frame how they study public policy. And so a little over 20 years ago, my PhD advisor, Peter May, developed this public policy morphology. And it's a way of organizing the ways in which people talk about the study of public policy. And it falls into four categories. And the first one in bold is what this book is concerned with: public policy processes, which are, as you can see, studies of the formulation and implementation of policy in domestic contexts. It includes studies in issue emergence, policy formulation, and implementation, things like that. But we also have people that study comparative public policy, which is descriptive research on the comparative tradition addressing differences in policy outcomes between countries or within federal systems. And I do some work in this field, and a lot of other people do too, in which we compare states. As this is being filmed, I'm doing some work on the COVID pandemic, and we're asking, why do some states do some things and other states don't? Things like masks and stay-at-home orders. That's a form of comparative public policy. We also compare public policy between countries. Why is it that the British have a national health service, which is very popular, for example, and the United States doesn't, for example? Or why is it that some countries' public utilities like electricity or telecommunications were largely held by the government rather than the private sector? We compare different countries to learn about the differences and to learn about why policy outcomes are different in different countries. Public policy analysis is a logic of an analysis and a mix of techniques in support of policy decision making. And it features what we would call economics-based rational analysis. And rational analysis is in quotes, because later in this book, you'll learn about public policy analysis and you'll learn about concepts like bounded rationality and things like that. Public policy analysis is a field that uses tools like cost-benefit analysis and other techniques to try to help people to understand why and under what conditions certain decisions should be made. It's an aid to decision-making. In the earliest days of policy analysis, it was hoped that would be a major form of information that policymakers could use to make policy. I'm not sure it's met its promise, and we'll get into that later into the book. And then public policy research, the last category, is applied, problem-driven, particular aspects of policy. So when somebody says, I study public policy, they might mean that they're a subject matter expert in something like health policy, energy policy, environmental policy, defense policy, and things like that. Oftentimes, studies of these tend to be descriptive and not terribly theoretical, although sometimes scholars in these areas draw upon theories from the policy process to explain why certain outcomes happen. I should know that Paul Sabatier years ago, he's a very well-known theorist of the policy process, argued that most people that study public policy are experts on the policy process. Most policy process scholars are experts on the policy process and then at least one substantive policy area. So for example, my expertise is in natural hazard policy, and I've branched out a little bit into industrial accidents, transportation accidents, in particular aviation, and now I'm getting into public health with COVID and things like that, you'll find that those of us who study a particular area of public policy generally learn enough that we can have something to say about why we have particular policy outcomes in that field. But it all helps to feed our studies of the public policy process and helps us to develop theories about the public policy process. Now, this is a great simplification, by the way. You should know that the study of the policy process is more complex than a simple table could convey, but this gives you some broad categories of some of the ways to think about the study of public policy. What I want to turn to now is some disciplines that study public policy, and I don't want to get too deep into the details of each cell of each table here because there's a lot to parse through. But I want to show you that various social science disciplines have an important role to play in policy process studies. So, for example, political science obviously deals with the process by which policies are made and enforced. Whereas sociology is about social life and social change. It's sociologists often overlap with political scientists, and there is political sociology. But community and group activities are really important because groups of people come together to take action in their communities and often to make political demands. And in some fields, for example, I mentioned natural disasters, which is my area of expertise. Much of the early and best work in the understanding of how people behave in disasters from a social scientific perspective was done in sociology. And so understanding the sociological aspects of community action can be really valuable in understanding public policy. Now, economics is really important because it studies the allocation of resources in communities, and in particular, the studies of markets and exchanges. And this is really important in policy process studies for at least two reasons. First, a lot of economic tools are used to analyze public policy, such as cost-benefit analysis, such as markets and market incentives and utility maximization and things like that. The second reason is that the economic factors influence public policy. And as you can see, I wrote such as economic growth, productivity, and unemployment. And the tools of economics are often used to explain why policies succeed or fail. But also the policy process is often involved in addressing problems of market failure, such as monopoly. Monopoly is a form of market failure. Imperfect information in a market or asymmetrical information where sellers have more information than buyers can be a problem in a market. And regulation is often intended to overcome information asymmetry. And so understanding economics can be really helpful to understanding why policies work the way they do. I had 3/4 of economics as an undergraduate and some economics in graduate school. I'll confess my math skills weren't as good as they needed to be to take more advanced economics training. I strongly feel that any social scientist should have a year's worth of economics under their belt. It's just such a useful and important field, and it informs so much of our discourse around public problems that understanding the way economists think about problems of allocation of markets and things like that is just incredibly useful. Now, public administration is really important. The sharp-eyed among you may have noticed that my sweatshirt I'm wearing today says Department of Public Administration on it at NC State. I am in a public administration department, and public administration and public policy tend to overlap to a considerable extent. In particular, public administration scholars study the motivations of program implementers and the targets of policy, and they help research innovations that improve service delivery. In other words, that improve the management of government programs that deliver the things that the program was set up to deliver, things such as police and fire services or public health or anything like that. Public administration scholars study, and there's a huge overlap between public administration and policy studies. And finally, public policy is the study of what governments choose to do or not to do, as we've talked about before. And we give this label to the highly interdisciplinary study of the policy process. Now, policy scholars like me develop theories about how the policy process works, and we develop tools and methods to analyze how policy is made and implemented. And I've given you a public policy process flavor of this. This is very much informed by my sense of the policy process as a key feature that characterizes public policy studies. So that's an overview of the public policy field. It's a fascinating field. Let me end on this note. I'll say this probably several times throughout these videos, but the study of public policy is a social science, but it's also a social science. And by that, I mean that it's people working together to study the policy process. And I've been blessed to work with some very, very smart people from all over the world. And my studies in public policy have exposed me to people from Europe, from Asia, from the United States, Canada, all over with brilliant ideas, really stimulating conversations I've had with people at conferences and through various means like my publications and their publications. You may not get all of this that you would get if you were to become an academic student of the policy process. But know that even if you're involved in public policy making, you'll be involved with other people that you'll want to work with, to work together to address and potentially solve public problems. It's an incredibly satisfying career. The work is really interesting, is endlessly rewarding. I can't recommend it enough. Of course, I probably wouldn't have written this book if I didn't enjoy it so much, but I hope you get a flavor of why I'm enthusiastic about this field, and I hope you share my enthusiasm.
Thanks for watching this video. As always, I really enjoy hearing from students and teachers about the book and about public policy. Feel free to reach out to me at tom@tomberkland.com or visit my website, tomberkland.com. Thanks again for watching.